Okay, so now that we've gone through the main ideas of the Communist Manifesto, let's complicate the picture a little bit. And I sort of hinted at this earlier. Marx sees society as being divided between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Okay, but in reality, especially now, but also even then, the bourgeoisie was not necessarily as coherently united as Marx would have you believe, right? So for example, the bourgeoisie can be broken down into different sectors, right? We have industrial capital, financial capital, agricultural capital, and a kind of petty bourgeoisie. And we'll talk a little bit more about these. And their interests are not necessarily always aligned. For example, if we look at the case of industrial capital and agricultural capital, one key example is if we look at the United States and we go back to Lynn, Massachusetts, is the tariff. Okay, so if you were an emerging industrial capitalist in Massachusetts and you were in the textile industry or the shoe industry, you were cultivating political ties in order to get the government to pass tariff protection so that you could be protected from, say, English industry, so that the industry would grow, right? Well, not all sectors of the capitalist class or the bourgeoisie class were necessarily supportive of that. The key sector that was not was plantation slave owners. So plantation owners in the American South, right? People that owned large plantations, cotton, tobacco, these kinds of people who owned, in many cases, dozens, hundreds of slaves, right? These were kind of the agricultural capitalists of the American South. Were against it. And the reason they were against it is because they fancied themselves as this kind of transported landed gentry, right? They didn't have peasants, they had slaves, but they very much modeled themselves on sort of the old English aristocrat. And they had a strong appetite for luxury goods, specifically luxury goods from Europe, right? Think of things that come from France and England. Right? So tariffs on goods from Europe to protect the emerging industries of the Northeast were opposed by Southern plantation owners because they liked to consume products that came from Europe. So in this particular case, you have one capitalist class in the North focused on industrial capital whose interests are a little bit at odds with agricultural capital, right? The most extreme example of this in a kind of different context is the American Civil War. We often think of the American Civil War as rightly so being fought over slavery, which it absolutely was. The American Civil War was absolutely about slavery. But if we complicate the picture a little bit more, what you're seeing also was a dispute between two ruling classes, between an industrial capitalist class in the North and a sort of plantation agricultural capitalist class in the South. One based on slave labor, the other based on free wage labor. And part of why the industrial North went to war against the South and ultimately destroyed slavery was because the industrial capitalists of the North were concerned that the agricultural capitalists of the South had too much power and control over the US government. By the 1850s and the 1860s, the sort of emerging industrial capitalists of the American North started to believe that the American government was no longer operating in its interest and was in fact operating at the behest of Southern slaveholders. And as a result of that, they had to be destroyed. So this is grossly oversimplifying the Civil War, but what's key here is that part of what leads to the Civil War is, yes, slavery, but part of the reason you get sort of industrial capitalists in the North on board with defeating slavery is because by defeating slavery, you defeat the power and wealth of Southern plantation owners who can no longer compete to control the US federal government. Okay, so again, it's a little bit more complicated. The bourgeoisie do exist as capitalists, but often have conflict with one another. The other key thing is sort of finance capital as well. Finance capital can be different and have different sets of interests than industrial capital. For example, if we look at modern society, one of the key things that finance capital has been a major driver of is the export of industrial jobs overseas, because there's potentially more money to be made. If you invest your money in a developed economy like Canada or the United States, you have a safer return on your investment, but a smaller return. If you invest your money in the quote-unquote developed world, it might not be as safe, but your return is potentially higher, right? So there are divisions that exist within the bourgeoisie class. And of course, another example then is what we often refer to as the Petty Bourgeoisie. And this is like small shop owners and remaining artisans, even though technically they do not belong to the proletariat because they own the means of production, right? Their interests do not necessarily align with the kind of captains of industry. Think of it this way. If you owned a grocery store, like a green grocer on a corner in Toronto, and then Walmart moves in, right? Technically, you both have capital in the sense that you are owners of capital and that you own your own business. But the difference between somebody who owns a small green grocer on a shop corner in Toronto versus the Walmart Corporation is night and day, right? Think of it also, it's partly why Kensington Market tries to keep chains out of Kensington Market, because they want independent coffee shops, independent grocers, independent merchants to survive. Otherwise, there's the fear that they'll be wiped out. So even though somebody that owns a coffee shop is technically a capitalist, right? Their interests are not necessarily the same as the guy that owns Starbucks. Think of it that way. Okay. Now let's complicate the picture of the proletariat. Now, there are internal class divisions within the proletariat as well. And we sort of hinted at this for those of you that were in my discussion group last week. It can be broken down in several ways, right? There's ethnicity, race, gender, skill. So the United States is a really good example because, as is probably the most obvious example, is the division between, say, workers in the United States who historically in the 19th century were white and workers that were not defined as white. The most obvious example in 1848, when Marx is writing the Communist Manifesto, is the difference between free white workers in the North and African-American slaves in the American South. Technically, neither of them own capital, but you can't really say their experiences are in any way the same, right? A free wage laborer in Massachusetts might be exploited by his employer, but compared to what a slave experiences at the hand of a plantation owner, I mean, completely different worlds at this point, right? So that's one way you can divide it, right? Ethnicity is also another. So if we complicate the picture again, if we look at, say, large cities in the United States in the 19th century, immigrants that were coming from Europe, initially, say, people of Irish descent, did not necessarily think of themselves in terms of solidarity with, say, workers in the United States that had been 3 or 4 generations ago, right? They defined their sort of identity more in terms of their ethnic background rather than their class, right? And it's not to say that this is some type of false consciousness. As we saw with the example of race, there is a hierarchy. And when the Irish first arrived, they didn't necessarily get the best jobs. They got the worst jobs and were exploited, right? And then, of course, they move up the hierarchy, and then another group from Europe comes in, and they're treated the same, right? So there is internal class divisions within the proletariat. Gender, of course, is also another one, right? We talked a lot about this in our discussion group. Even to this day, women earn 70 cents on the dollar, and that's women generally. When you break it down for race, particularly in the United States, white women may earn 70 to 80 cents on the dollar, but African-American women and Hispanic women earn even less on the dollar relative to men. So there are these internal class divisions. What you could argue in the modern context is it's a kind of intersectionality, right? Your identity is multifaceted. You might identify as somebody who's a wage laborer, but because of your specific ethnic, racial, or gendered background, determines how you relate to others. Right? You may have more privilege or less privilege depending on that background. And of course, skill is another one, right? Skilled workers often have different class interests than unskilled workers. Now, in the 19th century, this was often the difference between a general laborer and somebody who was a machinist or somebody who was in the sailing trade, right? Before steamships, being a sailor was considered a skilled trade. So your interests might be different than somebody who just works as a general unskilled laborer. And you often saw this in the labor movement in the early 20th century in the United States. You had labor unions that represented skilled workers and labor unions that argued you should represent everybody. But either way, it created internal divisions within the working class or the proletariat. If you want to think about this today in a sort of modern context, when we think of workers, we tend to think of the kind of, obvious Dickens example, right? Like people working on an assembly line. But if we use Marx's terminology, technically a worker is anybody who sells their labor and doesn't have access to capital. So that technically means somebody who is a lawyer at a law firm who is not a partner technically is only selling their labor. But again, if you're a lawyer earning $150,000 a year, right, you might actually make more money than somebody who owns their own business, right? Another really sort of absurd example would be athletes. So somebody like LeBron James makes millions and millions of dollars a year. Doesn't own the Los Angeles Lakers, so technically he's an employee of the Lakers. But it's ridiculous to think that somebody making that much money has the same class interest as a person making minimum wage in a grocery store or on an assembly line, right? So it's just something to think of. Okay, now we'll do a little bit of historiography here. And so we're going to first look at somebody I mentioned before, somebody named E.P. Thompson. Now, what was significant about E.P. Thompson is the way he complicated this idea of class. Now, Thompson argues that class is as much a function of culture as it is about your sort of naked self-interest, right? And it gets at this idea that there are internal class divisions, that class is as much about culture as it is about economic self-interest. And one of the interesting things that he argues is that, you know, one of the interesting things that Thompson argues is that class is often experienced through culture. That even though you think in terms of this kind of sort of economic self-interest, it's culture that often determines how you respond and how you defend your class position, right? And we see this all over the world, right? We see this in sort of the previous slide when we looked at how people might identify by ethnicity, race, or gender and see their sort of class interests as different than other people who, according to Marxist theory, are supposed to have the same self-interest, but in reality don't. This is a lot of what Thompson was getting at. And so in the early 1960s, when he wrote The Making of the English Class, he added this element of culture that was just as important in terms of economic self-interest. Why a group of people identify with one another is as much about a shared culture as it is about a shared sort of economic self-interest. Now, in the American context, a book written in 1984 by Sean Willens called Chance Democratic, New York City and the Rise of the American Working Class, he takes a lot of what Thompson was doing in England and looks at it in the United States. Specifically, he looks at the role of ideology in class formation. So even though he's sort of writing in a Marxian tradition in the sense that he's studying class conflict, he looks at how often somebody's self-interest is mediated through the way they think about government, the way they think about rights, and also sort of ethnic antagonisms that existed in New York City. Part of the reason you don't get a kind of all-encompassing proletariat is that these ethnic or cultural definitions of class are much stronger than a kind of naked economic self-interest, right? There has to be sort of ties that bind them together beyond, hey, you and I have the same economic self-interest, let's go fight for one another. Willens and Thompson argue that the culture is also key here. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. Just to sort of recap, we're looking at the emergence of class and class formations. We're looking at sort of how classes emerge under capitalism, how it creates these sort of internal divisions, right, between those that own the means of production and those that don't. We looked at the foundation of liberal thought and how it sort of provides the intellectual foundations for the emerging capitalism from Hobbes to Locke to Smith. And then, of course, we looked at the critics of capitalism, namely Karl Marx. We looked at him as a philosopher, as a sort of theorist of capitalism, and as a revolutionary. We looked at the main ideas of the Communist Manifesto, and then we sort of complicated the picture by looking at internal class divisions, why often the proletariat did not see itself in that sort of larger Marxian sense, but instead had these sort of identified more with these internal divisions, whether it be by skill, race, ethnicity, or in the case of the bourgeoisie itself. Often you had different self-interests of different sectors of the bourgeoisie. All right, I'll leave it at that. Next week we will look at the logic of capital, but before, I'm just going to make a short video about the midterm. Okay.